Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 160th New Social Environment. I'm Anya Bernstein and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between Olafur Eliasson, Dr. Julie Reiss, and Dr. Doug Dreishpoon. We're also thrilled to have the poet Valerie Deas here, who will read to close today's program. Today's conversation is generously supported by Hill Art Foundation, which is dedicated to providing access to art through exhibitions and education programs. You can find out more through the links that I will post in the chat. This October also marks the Rail's 20th anniversary, and we're committed to remaining independent, free, and accessible to all. The Brooklyn Rail acknowledges that we are on the unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape, Canarsie, Shinnecock, and Munsee peoples. We acknowledge the many indigenous nations with ties to this land, and we recognize that the Lenape still call Mannahatta home. Finally, the Brooklyn Rail stands in solidarity with the uprising unfolding across the country following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAtee, James Scurlock, Jamil Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, Toyin Salau, Walter Wallace Jr., and countless others, and in response to generations of structural violence against Black communities. Black lives matter, and we will continue to support ongoing action in the struggle for racial justice. Before I introduce our host and our guest, we'd like to begin with a brief moment of silence. Thank you. And now to introduce today's host and guest. Dr. Julie Reiss is an art historian who directs a master's program at Christie's Education. Julie has presented papers and chaired panels on issues related to art and climate change at conferences including the College Art Association and the Conference for the Council for European Studies. She is the author of From Margin to Center, The Spaces of Installation Art, and the editor of Art, Theory, and Practice in the Anthropocene. Dr. Doug Dreishpoon, Chief Curator Emeritus at the Albright Knox, is currently director of the Catalog Raison Project at the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation in New York City. His 26 years of experience in museums include such roles as curator of collections at the Weatherspoon Art Museum at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and curator of contemporary art at the Tampa Museum of Art in Florida. Doug is a consulting editor at the Brooklyn Rail. And Olafur Eliasson's art is driven by his interests in perception, movement, embodied experience, and feelings of self. He strives to make the concerns of art relevant to society at large. Eliasson's work spans sculpture, painting, photography, film, and installation. Not limited to the confines of the museum and gallery, his practice engages the broader public sphere through architectural projects, interventions in civic space, arts education, policy making, and issues of sustainability and climate change. In 2019, Eliasson was appointed Goodwill Ambassador for Renewable Energy and Climate Change by the United States Development Program. Eliasson lives and works in Copenhagen and Berlin. So without further ado, Julie and Doug, take it away.
Thank you, Anya. Well, I'd actually like to just quickly open my PowerPoint so that we can have some things to look at as we start the conversation. So let me do that. Okay. Doug, do you want to just start a little bit about how we got to setting this up the way we did, and then we can just kind of jump into everything?
Absolutely. So I want to thank the Rail for having us, Olafur for joining us, Anya for doing what you do and helping us move forward. I guess it's always good to have a couple of doctors in the house, but unfortunately we can't prescribe anything. So we're just doctors of ideas, for better or for worse. I thought you know, and Julie and I talked about pulling a PowerPoint together. We don't have that many slides, but the few that we have will help to prime the conversation and to keep us moving in the right direction. We thought a little historical context would be a good thing. And a lot of you may not know, but I think it's worth noting that I've always had this interest in modernist sculpture, and very recently completed a book that's part of the Documents of Modern Art series. And Olafur contributed what I thought was an incredibly cogent take on what he does and in the context of modern sculpture, mentioned the walking man. So I thought, for the purposes of creating a kind of envelope, let us say ideological envelope around what he does, that this was a very good way to start. So most of us know this piece, and it's, you know, it's a piece that's riddled with questions and anxiety. It's not about perfection. It's sculpture that exists in a kind of phenomenological field. Walking is terribly important to this piece, and also to what Olafur has done and thinks about. So the idea that this is a piece that you know, exists in a world of real circumstance, and for sculpture, and Rodin represents that kind of breach and break with what the ideal perfect object had always been, that we exist in a world that's about circumstance and about phenomena. So Olafur, I think it's a good place to start, because, you know, what you wrote for the book, What is Modern Sculpture, talked about the concept of becoming co-sculptural. And maybe we can talk a little bit about what that means, and in the context of Rodin, what he represents in terms of that historical precedent.
You have to unmute Olafur.
Silence reigns supreme.
Here we go. Now I'm actually to some extent here. No, so thank you everyone, Julie and Douglas, for having me, and for the whole Brooklyn Rail team. I realize now that you are so busy. Very impressed. Well done, everyone. It's excellent. I'm so pleased to be here. And then starting out with such a heavy question, it's not exactly small talk, is it? Jesus, what did I write in that text, Douglas? So no, but so being a layman artist on art history, obviously I'm allowed to sort of be a little more jazzy on topics of sculptural subjects, and so I was actually very proud to be invited to write something small for your book, Douglas, because I'm not exactly well known for writing. Well, let's say I'm known for not writing very well, if anything at all. But listen, the point is, I have been very interested in when and to what extent was you know, temporality, or the process of passing, or the passing of time. When was it decentralized to the point you could allow the viewer to be a temporal agent? Somehow my headset changed a little bit. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
So this notion of you know, to decentralizing the authority of, well, obviously there's the artist who, despite how nice they are, they do indulge themselves in some self-mythologization. I cannot also take myself out of that, even though I've tried profoundly to keep myself out of the sort of artist genius modern mythology. It kind of sneaks up on me, and it is daunting how fast it does that. But this notion of when is it actually possible to de-authoritize the work of art, or the mode in which it is presented, or the whole sort of construct around an institution or gallery, or the sort of platform on which culture operates. De-authoritize into, so like authority. How do you allow for the viewer to go beyond what phenomenology offered the viewer, such as saying they are really important because they are a subject, but how do you go further than that and claim some kind of co-production, like really like participation in the writing of narratives or rewriting narratives, which are obviously so important today, right? So the viewer, the status of the viewer, the mandate, you could say. So one good example I always found was, you know, in 1910, Bergson, in his book Durée. See, now this is not the, is that the title of the book? Famous Bergson book. Anyway, its own books came out 20 years ago with an American translation. Bergson had a wonderful passage on temporality, or the passing of time, where he opened up for a few discourses. But before him, there was, I mean, quite a bit earlier, there was the experimental photography by Marais, and Muybridge, who was a little less, well, also very experimenting, but a little more sort of rationalist. He claimed to have depicted time in these famous Muybridge photos that everyone probably knows, you know, the running horse, or the sort of the, was it some kind of sport person, or things that moved essentially. And of course they became very famous when Edgerton, the American Edgerton, did the strobe light photography of hummingbirds and you know, tennis player or something like that, right? But and they claim to have depicted temporality or depicted time, and Rodin got very upset. It was interesting because, as I understand it, Rodin to a large extent had like many others at the time, worked with sculpture up against the wall. It was like some, not necessarily something you would have in the middle, if at all it was the middle of a court, like an outdoor space. So there was it was actually, he said, no, let me show you what time is. And as I understand it, he claimed, and it is debated here and there, but the thing is, he said, I will compose a series of, should I say, mix of muscles that are not just from one posture. It doesn't really very clearly say, and it is, I have a small anecdote on see, now we look at this as it is depicted from the front, and we could say that the photography with which this is taken is in a way not representing Rodin's interest in the best possible way, because obviously what Rodin said is, no, time is the time it takes for you to walk around the sculpture. It doesn't really have a front or back or side and side. The time, it is the time that you spend walking around it, and the time it takes you to take in the sculpture. And that means he didn't put the time in the sculpture, even though it is meant to have a mix of muscular positions in different parts of a step. It's really hard to see whether this is actually true, but his point is that this is a kind of a little plurality of temporality, and the point, and the only way of sort of tying those pluralities together is when the viewer takes his or her time, or claims the time, which is why I called the show at MoMA 12 years ago, Take Your Time. Anyway, so interestingly, Rodin said, no, time is actually in the eyes, or in the engagement, or in the situation, and it is never in an object. Obviously, there's so many different takes on this, but let me just mention two others. Molinars, then, with the light modulator, really also for the first time sort of claimed to say, well, this sculpture doesn't have a state of art where it is perfect. It's just like an ongoing little chaos, right? And more famously, because Beatrice Colomines, the art historian, did so great work on the fact that the Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona pavilion was by Mies, and you know, probably you know, he was together with Lee Reiss, his partner and assistant first, and then partner, Lily Reiss, I think. There was this idea of the sliding doors, you know, the kind of, you know, the Barcelona pavilion, which is just a flat roof on a flat plane, then just like kind of walls scattered around, all more or less perpendicular, or they are perpendicular. But as you walked around the pavilion, it was as if the walls sort of opened up and closed in, and you would see something else. And there wasn't, as he said, a right or wrong angle. You just like, and it is it's a very lively thing to walk around it. But of course, like this photo, Mies was only ever photographed from a certain angle, the kind of beautiful one. And in photographs, also only depicted in black and white. And gradually, the documentation of many temporal ideas were even, deprived them in the nature of photography from that temporal element. So getting back to what is as the visitor, the person who's looking at art, what was our what mandate? Do the museum trust us to own time? Are we the keeper of the time and not the museum? Of course, this notion of if we are keeper of time, that means that there is a different time for everyone coming to the museum. And that is where now I spent a long time talking about that little Rodin sculpture. But my interest in art has very much, as you maybe also briefly mentioned in the introduction, I've been so interested in, well, how do we actually acknowledge the unique producing potential of a participant in an exhibition?
Right.
Like
So Julie's going to jump in and talk about the Weather Project, Olafur. But I would just say that as a coda to what you just said, that we're talking about objects that have agency, objects
Mm-hmm.
that we tend to think of sculpture as an object, and I think in the course of our conversation, that perception may change. And the object may become something else. It may become a system. It may become something more diffuse, a network, in fact. But agency is important. And I think that what you do, that your objects, if we look at them as objects, are portals to another way, another perceptual dimension, and portals to a kind of raised level of consciousness about who we are as human beings and about where we exist, simply. So, Julie, do you want to jump in and give a little?
I just wanted to get from Rodin and all the ideas that you were talking about involved with temporality and the viewer and a different way of experiencing sculpture. I think what is probably one of your best known works, and I hope that many of the people watching today will make that connection. In the text that you recently wrote, you talk about the idea of co-sculpting, and I really like the idea of moving beyond phenomenology. Phenomenology could be a very personal, individual, bodily experience. It wasn't a relational experience as such. It didn't require the presence of other people. And in some ways, the relational aspect of your work, it takes that a step further. With the Weather Project, what has always struck me about the images of it is simply the focus on how people were experiencing it. And I think that's the moving from sort of co-sculpting to coexisting. And if I'm sort of understanding the timeline of your work accurately, the Weather Project really came before you your work became that deeply invested with the climate crisis as it is now. But already the idea of experiencing the outer world, bringing it inside the context of bringing some aspect of nature into the museum was already there. And I just wonder if now, looking back, how do you see this work in the scheme of where you've gone from there?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. Where I've gone from there. I mean, I'm asking myself that as well. But the thing is, it's not just me who have gone. We have all moved, and everything is, so to speak, on the move. That's maybe one of the weaker points on phenomenology. It is not really subscribing to this notion of everything being trajectories or journeys or just like what is it? Triple O's, right? The object-oriented ontologies, that everything is just like a network of things with agency. We humans are just like one of many. We happen to have quite a big impact on everything else, but we're not necessarily more interesting, and so on and so forth. See, now that is Timothy Morton and Graham Harmon, and maybe most interesting also, what's her name? Staying with the Trouble, so amazing. Haraway, yes, important to mention her. But so the thing is, so where have I gone? Well, I've changed, like everything else. Even my computer, which seems to be standing still, is like kind of on a journey too. And I think one valid point is that I've become better at accepting that I am gonna go to Berlin next week, Corona allowing that to happen. I'm gonna look at a painting at the gallery in Charlottenburg. And that painting is also traveling to meet me next week. I mean, it's sitting on the wall in the museum, I get that. It's been there for 2 world wars, you know, it's been there for a while, but it's been busy. It's like been busy not to be bombed and been busy, you know, greeting everyone on the way. It's like it's been changing a lot, right? So this notion, it's a meeting up between me and that painting. It's very nice to prepare a little bit for how do you come to the painting with the right amount of generosity. And you know, it's been traveling a lot longer than me. It's a couple of 100 years old, and so on and so forth. It's a painting by Caspar David Friedrich. So if you kind of get to that, this notion of everything being suddenly, if not completely relative, but everything is at least negotiable, the amount of agency and so on, then you can also start asking, well, this chair I'm sitting on when I'm over there, it was a tree. And that tree was that kind of tree. I can see it on the chair. It used to be an oak tree. And at some point, because it's not been painted with, you know, with a plastic lacquer, it is oiled, it seems. It will be probably, I don't know when, but in 500 years, let's say that it's going to be a tree. No, it's going to be soil first and then the tree again, maybe even. You see, so it's on a journey. So for the time being, it's just busy being a chair. It is chairing right now. And in that way, I've come to appreciate this notion of the fact that reality is in fact relative. And that gives me the self-confidence to say, well, then it can change. You know, that means that things are actually much more flexible than we think. And they can also change to the better, and they can change to the worse. And that means that I'm actually capable of also evaluating, well, what do I then have to offer? Can I do something if it's not like I have to take everything for granted, being what the, you know, just like, you know, oh, that's how God made it, if you would subscribe to that idea, or this is just how it is. It's nothing changes anyway. You know, it doesn't matter if I vote, if you want to go that right. Now, the whole notion that actually, it seems things can change. And so museums obviously have seemed, or institutions, they often seem to find some comfort in claiming this is a timeless masterpiece. It's the same as saying, well, this is never going to change. And that, I think, is a threat, because obviously we go to museums to somehow sharpen our senses, to de-numbify ourselves. We go there because we want to synchronize with the times and the values and the sort of things we believe in. We don't come to be sort of deprived our agency. We want to know that we want to leave the museum knowing that we matter, we are good enough. And that is where suddenly, you know, this notion of deauthorizing and so on, that has become very important for me, the role of cultural institutions within the greater civic society. And Tate, I think that exhibition very much represented a beginning on that.
Well, just as a quick follow-up, I think, would it be fair to say that for you, co-sculpting and agency in the context of a museum, in the context of the art world, that it just very easily moved to coexistence in nature? I mean, I think that's a very interesting leap, and I don't want to completely move the conversation entirely that way, because I love that we also can talk about sculpture and your work in a lineage of interactive and relational sculpture. But I find that that analogy to me is so interesting, the link between social relations and our relationship to nature, what you've contributed to getting rid of the divide between nature and culture. And that's, I guess, what I find so interesting about the Weather Project, is that even though it anticipates, it comes before what you've been doing more recently, just in its emphasis on agency, it focused on already getting people moving toward becoming more involved, to becoming a community and to working together. So I'm just curious how, in your way of thinking, those two work together, the co-sculpting to the coexistence.
And so, and Julie, can I just jump in and offer, my response to the weather project too, I think immediately of someone like Reiss, and the difference between you and she in terms of agency and in terms of what is the environment, and what kind of response does it produce on the people that are there. One feels like the people at Tate are having a grand old time, and that there's some kind of spectacle going on the one hand. On the other hand, the agency to the work is about how can it raise consciousness? It's not a hedonistic environment, although one can chill out and have a grand old time there. But how do you see, what are the legs to agency, and how does agency become active,
Well, I think that, there is the agency, there's a kind of, when you say agency, when does it become active? I think one can also say, where is this sort of convergence of agency where it becomes like a mindset or an idea, and then it becomes an action, the sort of difference between thinking about doing something and then actually doing something. I do think that, I also just, to what Julie said first, I just want to address, there is in art history pretty much almost none description of a collective experience. There's like a million texts about Mona Lisa, but nobody ever sees Mona Lisa alone. And everyone also mentions that they are never alone. But if you look through art history, it's just not there, that you are never alone. There's cultural theory and all of that where that is being discussed, but just this idea of being with people, and there in nature and in landscape and in gardens, there is a much stronger tradition for the shared space. And of course, in this course of work on urban planning, urban sort of theory is not really urban planning, sounds like when you're doing it. But anyway, since what's his name, Haussmann, I always say, the French city planner who just got through the city with all the militaristic sort of big streets. But in urban spaces, there's a lot of theory on the social idea of sharing, right? And there is there's all the work on meeting the other, one could say, in the glissant sense of the other. So whereas in museums, it's normally this idea that you are going by yourself, and it's highly intimate. So these are different sort of topographies almost that are interesting to say, and maybe there is an under-fertilized potential of togetherness in museums, that the shared experience. So it's like concerts, that's much more sort of clear that you're not just alone. Imagine if you're Rolling Stones, so you're the only one there. There's like, if all the theory on music would be written as if you're the only one listening to it. So anyway, so there's a sort of a cloud of ideas there. And in nature and in city space, there is a strong tradition. So at the Tate Show and in other pieces, I very much try to subscribe to a sort of predetermined idea of collectivity. So it's not that I actually didn't make these works that we're looking at into collective experiences. I was just almost as a ready-made, including things where they are used to being sharing. They might feel very alone in a contemplative sense in a landscape or a lunar landscape in Iceland or something like that, but they're very conscious about the shared sort of the layers of sharedness in that. So, and then getting back to you, the notion of the convergence of the agency, because I think there is a somewhat, maybe we all have acknowledged that you can, once the context provides it, that everything has agency, and that means like almost like nothing has agency. It's a little bit like when my hairdresser says, "Well, I'm in a way also an artist," then it just doesn't matter anymore. So no, nothing wrong with my hairdresser though. But the thing is, it's a good question on what levels does art, or the system in which art is a part of, actually convey or converts things into action, because it's really difficult. And also one should consider, it doesn't mean that it's instantly or tomorrow or right away and so on, but it could be maybe in 30 years, just the day before I die, I finally become an activist, right? The principle is more interesting. What does actually that mean? And I've been working a lot on that, and there's a great, for instance, German behavioral psychologist Elke Weber, who works at the UN for the climate that's how I met IPCC, the one who does the so-called climate report, and she works on how on earth are we going to put that report into action. Because like one thing is that kind of, well, like Bible in a way, because it's like at least as it, or probably more important than the Bible as I see it. But you know, the kind of, well, the paper is not enough. And so and then there's all the biases, the positive bias, the negative bias, like all that mess. So I've talked a lot about the denomification process, the idea of actually claiming back your body, claiming back your time, being, you know, having a sense of being listened to. And that's why I occasionally talk about art, is that you look at an art, you engage in an art situation, and you go like, oh, I know that feeling. I'll make this a short one because I've said this now for so long time. I know this feeling, this landscape here, this is me. It is as if you read a book and there is a person doing something in the book. I'm reading a book and there's a woman who just says this, and I say, this is exactly what I would have said. This person is representing my interest. It is articulating what I want to say, but I just did not get around to say it. And that's why poetry, that's why Valerie is so important, because she gives language to things that are hard to otherwise come around to say for someone like me, who's not very articulate, right? So that one could say is a sort of a micro a reflection where I leave the museum and say, bloody hell, it was as if the painting listened to me. I must be good enough, which is why I think the museum should be cautious over explaining, putting the headphones on everyone, telling them that they can't do it themselves. I'm not a complete purist, and I get it, right? But it is so important that we allow the sort of totally normal lay man or woman to just stand at a painting and say, I am actually not looking at the painting is looking at me. And there is something there, because you would, in that moment, I think, be allowed to exercise a few degrees of, or a few sort of moments of criticality. There is in that contextual idea of acknowledging, well, I actually do bloody exist. If the painting sees me, I am in the world. And if the world is not static but relative, it means I can actually even do something. At least I can vote. Right now, next week I will have to go vote, for God's sake. Well, not for God's sake. Vote for your own sake in this case. It's not like he's not here, and it's not going very well as it is already, right? So there is a micro, and in the interest of this time now, we could just scrub all the way across, because that's my point with convergence, all the way across. Then we have the whole cultural, institutional tissue in civic society. We have thousands of museums. We totally forget that cultural institutions or culture, just to take culture in Europe, and I actually don't know for America, but in Europe, the cultural sector has more economy, more employment, has more stability financially than the car industry. And that is also it's also used car. And the car dealers, it's like the whole car industry is smaller than the cultural one. The culture has public and private and philanthropic money mixed. It's completely chaotic, decentralized. It's like pretty much close to anarchistic. If you look at it from like this, it's an incredible system. And what it does, well, it has the feet on its ground everywhere. It has a moral, I wouldn't say high ground, but you know, it's incredible. It's unbelievable. That is an unprecedented infrastructure. Of course, no one in the culture sector seems to think anything particular of it, because we always think that we're marginalized, that we are on the periphery, and referring to things like center periphery and marginalized and non-marginalized, it's like it's over. It's not like that. So I very often sort of try to say, okay, this is the macro, and there's a lot of muscle in the macro. We're just too timid to somehow get that organized in the same very beautiful, messy way that culture works otherwise. That's actually why I was very interested in Hank William Thomas's White Awakenings. Because it has that self-organized way of connecting. It was a messy network. It was so interesting. I think he's such a great artist in this way that he actually also allows for a much needed type of spirituality in something that is very pragmatic, like doing something, right? So culture, I think, actually means convergence, because if culture is not capable about thinking of its own construction. Like culture is when something is referring or re-evaluating itself. If it's not that, it's either capitalism or nature, right? So culture has this very profound idea of checking if it exists, a bit like humans also, right? But you get the picture. There's more like a metaphor. And so I'm actually I'm very confident that, you know, all these questions, poorly solved or answered, or good, bad, and bad art, or, you know, like, so it's like everything together. It's actually quite wonderful.
So Olafur, we're gonna move into some other slides, but here's an existential question: Is the system of capitalism compatible with the system of nature?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think that
maybe you don't have to answer it in depth, but you know, therein lies the tension.
Well, the problem with capitalism is that it hasn't seen nature as a worthy of investment, and that is because capitalism by nature is short-term and short-termistic, and nature is long-termistic, and you know, and in that sense, they're not very good friends because. Well, capitalism is not very good friends with nature. Nature doesn't really care about capitalism. So the thing is, we spoke about this sort of idea of collectivity and shared ideas before. I mean, if one should sort of bring in where, you know, where the triple O's, where they bring us, I guess the question of interspecies presence, the beyond human, more than human friends, right?
Let me go to that one.
My dog Vico has great personality.
Nice to take a look at it while you're talking. Here we go. I love this one.
Oh, this one. Oh, more than human friends. I even made a work called that.
Yes.
Yeah, more than human friends. No, so anyway, so the term, of course, comes from the fact that we are celebrating UN a little bit. We're celebrating UN's 75th year's birthday, right? And the Human Rights Charter is actually also about 75 years. It came a little later, just a tiny bit later. The Human Rights Charter was interesting and quite amazing, and it's really good fun to read it, I have to say. The short version is like unbelievable progressive still. It's probably because the world is not really very, there's still a lot to do. But anyway, what we forgot back then 75 years ago was our friends, the plants, and our friends, the species. And then, you know, the commons, the ocean, the sky, and the environment, and so on at a large. This means that we have somehow prioritized humans so long now that everything has kind of gotten out of sync. And we have now a situation where we are suddenly in so many radical ways talking about more than human interests. We have the legislative, sort of increased legislative systems that are now giving things and objects and trees and animals rights of personhood. And it's not so unusual anymore. The river Ganga in India has the rights of personhood. New Zealand and it's not Venezuela, it is Bolivia and another country next to Bolivia, Ecuador, yes. So the rights of given the rights of personhood, there is also now the question, well, how is the General Assembly going to look? Because the antelope wants to sue the lion. And I'm not kidding. I'm really not kidding, because it's very interesting. Interspecies is, of course, also, it goes back to sort of Maturana and Varela and the mind and life people and Buddhism and Hinduism. There's a lot of, you know, sort of primarily contemplative faith system that has a whole different set about how we are as humans. Pretty much nothing more than upright walking, unhealthy weeds. Is that how you say? That is actually that's actually from Staying with the Trouble. Say her name again.
Donna Haraway.
I have a book right here because I don't know why I can't remember that name. So anyway, we are upright walking weed. We're really nothing special. But my greater point is this idea of you know, the whole infrastructure, and I brought up this legislation. There's the Earth Clients in London, where the Air of London sued the City of London. First they lost, And then they took it to High Court, and then they won. Because there's too much pollutants in the air, and it says in the law there can only be so much pollutants. So the air sued the city. And so I think we are looking at a new 75 years, getting back to the Human Rights Charter, where we're going to have human rights, rights of plants and species, and all of that. And we, the culture sector, are very much, I think, one of the places where these much more progressive ideas, together with other various communities who are bringing these to attention, these type of questions. And this particular work, these are actually logs or tree logs. They fall in the water north of Russia in the big rivers where the forestry industry is. Then they sail 10 to 20 years through the North Pole, freeze every winter, and get stuck in the ice, which is why they get that funny shape. And then they kind of drift on to the shore in Iceland, and has that incredible silvery color, having been baked by the sun for so long. A lot in Greenland too, and it comes all the way down to, Nova Scotia, the Goose Bay, and Labrador, and that. And some very few logs, they go down all the way down to Florida, and there the Gulf Stream picks them up. It's really funny, and the Gulf Stream sends it back and hits Ireland, Scotland, and a few goes on the south coast of Iceland. So if you are traveling around Iceland, don't forget that the logs on the beach of the south coast have had a significant longer journey than the one on the north coast, just in case you're into logs on beaches. And these, I just picked them up and sent them to my studio. And I added a little watercolor, I should say, as you can see, onto the log.
I wondered if we, on this idea of the journey, bringing one thing from one place to another, having something that might look very simple, actually having had a complicated history in terms of its journey in the natural world. I did want to just spend a couple of minutes talking about Ice Watch, because it's a work that in some ways you started it in a similar form as a gallery piece, as Your Waste of Time. And then it became Ice Watch, which has now been done in several different places. You mentioned something that I've just always kind of wondered about your work. You said eventually before you die, maybe you'll become an activist. What is that sort of, that convergence between wanting to raise awareness and actually pushing through to the other side to actual activism? I mean, do you feel that's somehow been your gradual trajectory, or is that something that you sort of stay clear of, in the idea that people themselves are going to own this if you give them the experience of it? Do you understand what I
I know, normally I don't say I give them the experience. They already have the capacity for experience. I just make some stuff, and then I don't
mean the experience. You give them the situation in which they can have an experience, and it's pretty open-ended.
Yeah, and it's also good questions, because sometimes the questions are better than the answers, because the answers are always so tidy, and it's like you make a mess with a question and then I come and clean it up, and it's not really, it's much more fun to make the mess than it is to clean it up. But I think the point here,
I just always wondered. I feel like I had the chance to ask you. I had to ask you.
No, it's also great. I'm just winning time here to kind of find out what to say. So I've become friendly with someone who I consider one of the greatest activists in the world. It's Kumi Naidoo from South Africa. He was as a young teenager, he was a unionizer to took the youth it's the unions that got Mandela out of jail, right? So he was like very important in that movement. He had to run out of South Africa, and then he, long story, went through Oxford, and then he became head of Greenpeace, and he was the head there for I think 14 years or so. And then he was brought in just for 2 years because Amnesty International had some challenges in infrastructure, and then he was there for 2 years and just left that. He dangled, when I went to art school in '89, he was dangling off an oil rig on the south coast of Iceland in a rope with some kind of chain so that they couldn't get him off, so together with some other brave people. And Kumi cannot swim. No fucking hell. So I just want to say that there are like activists, and then there's like people who like me, who are so excited about I can put ice on the town hall square. And we just have to see the kind of policy work, the advocacy work, the awareness building, sort of campaigning, and the whole level like activism. And I think a lot of activism is quite not, conservative and so on. So it's like a little, but all in all, it's so important to not delabel or to somehow claim that space, because culture and art and these things, it would be disrespectful for Kumi hanging in that, hanging off that oil rig, would I claim being an activist. And I'm so proud to be an artist in the first place, and so on. So having said that, it doesn't mean that there is not enough space for also a lot of hybrids and a lot of sort of collaborations. I collaborated with Kumi several times actually, and I'm sorry if I interrupted a question, but I just think that it's a little bit like if I say I'm an architect. I'm really not. I also think it's much better to say I'm an artist, and then I don't have to worry about if there has to be a shoe closet in the building. It's like, it doesn't matter. It's a work of art. There's no room for shoes.
Olafur, I think that's very well stated. And really perhaps what we're talking about is, where does activism reside in the aestheticized arena of the art world? And what is the line that one crosses as an artist to become an activist? And what are the platforms? So within the art world, it's easy to aestheticize something, and your ice watch is easily aestheticized. But then on the other side of that perceptual coin, there's also the possibility for an extreme look at what the climate is becoming. So the other question that comes up, which is a really interesting one, is the difference between politics and poetry. You're an artist because you're half poet, and what's important is the ambiguity of that space. And if it becomes too political, it becomes too black and white. So to reside in the interstitial space that is the ambiguous space gives you a subversive edge. At least that would be my optimistic take on it.
Yeah, but we should also not de-activist art. If you think of really everything, Gordon Matter Clark cutting off parts of buildings, and art has always had Guy Debord and the Situationist, the Dadaism. There's so much Wiener what is it called? Wiener activism. And it goes up and down, of course, but there's lots of progressive activistic ideas. What I said earlier about feeling listened to, maybe there is a typical, and this is just really a trend, there's a typical difference, and I've talked to Kumi about it, who activists seems to tell you what to do, and especially if you're not doing it right, they tell you you're really bad and not doing the right. This is a generalization, because I know it's much more complex, of course, but artists, I think, well, some art is probably the same. See, now it's already falling to pieces what I wanted to say, but art has a potential of saying, you need to fucking change without making it sound like you're doing something wrong. Mm-hmm. So I think there is that idea of inclusion in this ability that art or culture has to actually acknowledge there is a discrepancy in our views. We are not the same, but this is a safe space in which being different can be tackled by having difficult conversations. And isn't that what we would all want our access to museums to be about, that, or to culture to be about, anything really? Here is a safe space in which we have difficult conversations. Of course, one can say that is a kind of activism, but why not just say this is art? And this is what art also is capable of. I'm my downstairs neighbor in Berlin is the Ai Weiwei, the artist, there is, it's just important. It's just important. If I know I'm actually talking a little bit too much here, so I'll just be mindful of time. When he was in China, and he couldn't leave, right? He was in house arrest and all of that. And I apologize for the people who might not know this, because I take for granted, I should be careful of the elitism here, taking for granted everybody just knows that. But he could not leave China. The government has taken his passport, and he was locked into his house at some time and then into a jail cell at some time. So anyway, he could be on the phone, and I was doing a work of art, collaborating with him. I've known him for many years. And the work of art was a digital work of art, which was like a planet or moon on the internet, and we were doing it together. So we had a sort of, in the kind of like a virtual space, we had a sort of a moon, it was called. And then everybody could go in and make graffiti on it, like toilet graffiti. This is like really anything. And somebody did a Mona Lisa, and just a lot of people made dicks for some weird reason. Makes no sense at all. But of course, then somebody started to make a swastika. And that is hate speech, I said. So I called Ivar, I said, this is not okay, we cannot have swastikas. Also, by the way, according to German law, it's illegal. No, he said, that is censorship. It's against freedom of speech. And to make that story long, because of course, what it was about, when you sit in China and you cannot get out, you can't travel, being deprived of freedom, the idea of censoring anything at all was a threat. Where I was in a well-functioning country, Germany, which is run by grown-up people, unlike America, if you don't take it too personal here. But actually, Germany is in many ways a relatively stable democracy. Not to say that all of that, So anyway, so sitting where I was sitting, it was about preventing hate speech because it was about securing freedom of speech. And you see, so everything's kind of relative to context. And I don't know whether I hit it spot on, but he's obviously also very often considered an activist in his approach and these things. And I've been a little cautious to kind of just, why is art not capable of also being, it's like kind of also taking that space. I think art has maybe lost some of its potential activistic dimension by constantly accrediting exterior forces of artistic potential. So say this is, art is actually a kind of activism, but I'm just very careful. I haven't found the right wording.
I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense, especially the idea that an artist can maybe come in and do something in the name of art, which would be less effective or hit people in a different way, or simply there wouldn't be the space that would open up to make the thing in the first place, except in the world of art. I've just thought a lot about how, can art do something? And I think in these situations that you offer people, something is happening there. And it goes beyond simple awareness. Everyone knows that ice melts, right? This is an obvious fact, but something is going on here in that this is this first person encounter with a, thousands of year old piece of glacial ice. The idea of bringing it to people so that they can actually have a more direct understanding of, to use Tim Morton's word, this hyper object, which is impossible to understand because it's so huge. So I love this. I think it's also just a very interesting contrast, and maybe we could just finish here with your most recent work, which in a lot of ways seems to me to be the exact opposite. It's a remotely situated, large-scale work, and I think, that's and how do you get from here to here? I would just be interested if you wanted to take a couple of minutes and talk about this this most recent piece.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for being so generous. The two of you are so so interesting to listen to. So I feel sorry for having spoken so much. The thing is, Icewatch was motivated by my wish to do more on the street, as people who are not necessarily conscious of this being art are often very open-minded when confronted with something abstract. So abstraction really has a lot of potential when it is not this piece, yes, with the town hall in Copenhagen, and the UN Board for Climate Sciences, who are in Denmark to write the last part of the climate report, building up for the summit in Paris, the COP15, where the Paris Agreement was made. All the scientists was in Copenhagen. So on that occasion, I had a I called around at town hall and at anyone I could get really, and the Danish Foundation public the city and the Danish Foundation Realdania, they came together quickly funding bringing this ice on a in a fish container. So after one day the fish smell has worn off, and what it's interesting, I just have to say that it has a little bit of a smell, and what it smells of is that it's full of tiny bubbles, like thousands, right? And the bubbles is compressed air from 10,000 years ago. And in that little bubble is only that air. That's why we make core drilling, so we know how much carbon dioxide was in the air 10,000 years ago, right? This is because of the ice. But if you find a little pocket, it's sort of like holding your hands in a bowl, and there's not wind. It fills up with that very cold air because it's so cold. And these bubbles are under a lot of pressure. The ice is like kind of pressed, sitting underneath a big glacier like that, right? And you can sort of go and sniff in that smell, which is a little bit like ice, but it has a kind of interesting, realization. You go like, oh, I am breathing oxygen from 10,000 years ago. It's incredible, and so on and so forth. And the most common thing is that people go and they hug the ice or they touch the ice and say, oh, it's cold. Oh, I get wet. So we know everything about ice from reading about it, right? And now there's ice like in the newspaper every week, but not so many people have actually hugged ice lately. And so there's a whole beginning of a story there, and there's a huge collective sort of element to this, because I sometimes had some movement experts, I call it really dancers, go, and I had 10 or 15 people go, and then they all went and hugged the ice. Then everyone else also started to hug the ice. The humans are so stupid. And then so as soon as you kind of like do certain things, so there is a kind of optimization potential in having dancers go and sort of do a little bit of how should I say, emotionalization. Then everyone gets like really into that. That's actually the first time I ever said that. It's funny, right? So anyway, getting back to the piece that we actually just opened on an alpine top, not so far from Bolzano, very close to the city Meran. There was a film recently called Everest that Baldassar, the Icelandic, that's why I said Icelandic, right? Baldassar did. And it's actually shot there because it has that kind of Himalayan Mount Everest sort of feeling. It's 3,400, something like that, 3,400 meters. And up on that very top, this is an instrument. Is that the only photo we have of it?
Oh, I have this one as well here.
Oh, so anyway, it's an instrument in which you can stand in the center, and these are all the solar orbits. And the horizontal ring going around it is the horizon, and the four beams holding the horizon that you could see through that little slit there is actually a compass. So that's east, west, south, north, and then the cyan color of the glass. There is something from the beginning of really mountaineering, which is called the cyanometer. There's I think a few. Humboldt, also the German scientist, had one, and it is a cyanometer primarily was used to measure the blueness of the sky, which turned out to be not really of scientific importance, but it was one of these many instruments where we were just looking for modernity to some extent, but we were looking for how to quantify and measure and to systematize and organize, like Galileo did, right? The guy who found out that the sun is actually in the center and the earth is going around it, even though this instrument seems to suggest that the sun is moving. So sitting up there, you are actually about 1,000 meters above a glacier that has 15 years left to live. And a local association who are a water preservation interest groups, like a local group of people who are trying to secure water and prevent the exploitation of natural resources, and also over commercializing the Alps. The alpine environment have, of course, struggled with the sort of brutal impact of skiing, for instance, right? So there are actually great forces, and I was so proud because he lives there to meet Messner, the incredible, the greatest mountaineer of all times, I think. Probably there's some young ones. But Reinhard Messner is he's the one who did climbed Everest like on one hand, with the other tied and closed eyes and no oxygen and so on. So truly, like, no, I'm just kidding. So anyway, so this is a community of mountain lovers. And so for me, it was a great chance. Everyone participated, the local companies, the Smith company, everything was done really with no art being shipped around the world, which is so hypocritical, I should say that. But this time I actually didn't. This is like a local, finally something done just down the valley. So it is, again, looking down at the glacier, knowing, oh, holy moly, this has 15 years left. We're gonna have a funeral soon. 15 years, I'm gonna hopefully be alive in 50 years. I'm gonna go to the funeral of a very famous glacier. And what do you then say to a funeral of a glacier, a late glacier, which is something Andres Snyder, the Icelandic environmentalist, does in Iceland, these funerals for glaciers. And so in that way, I was hoping here to create a little not so skiing or organized and not so skiing focused, but a different idea of a platform right there at the top to sensitize ourselves to the fact that, well, the sky is blue, south is there. That means if south is there, that means Paris is this way, right? My mother lives in this way. And it grounds you. It's a little bit, Bruno Latour said in his latest book on the environment, down to earth. So it's a sort of it's a GSM, ground position, GPS, GPS, a ground positioning system. This is the sun paths only on this spot, just like everywhere else on the latitude is this. So if you're at equator, they are, as you can imagine, they go up like this. And it just means when you stand there, you could also see what time it is, see what month it is, and all of that. So I mean, the way I explained it, of course, is very mechanical and so on and so forth. Having made the effort to even get to the sculpture, which is taking a ski lift, the bigger part, so it's not all that difficult. And then you have to walk about half a kilometer on pretty rugged, and it's a cat. If you take the other photo, back to the other photo, yeah. You see there's a pretty steep drop on both sides. You see that's one of the narrow paths. It's just like literally on the left side here, it literally goes down about 2 kilometers. So it's if it's windy and so on and so forth. So I'm very excited about it because I used to go to mountains a lot in Iceland when I was younger. So this made me feel almost reborn. Hochjoch-Ferner Glacier.
So I just had one question because when I saw this piece, I immediately thought of Nancy Holt's Sun Tunnels and Smithson's Spiral Jetty, both of which require a bit of a pilgrimage. Would you say that that's consistent with your concept, and on a pragmatic level, how does one get there?
Yeah, it's not quite that. Europe is so America. One have to give that to America. There's a bit more space out there in between things, right? So. It's the Alps. I mean, show me a spot in the Alps which is not already overrun. So just to be honest also, I think the thing is you can go to Bolzano, you drive 1 hour to, Bozen in Germany. Then you go to Como first if you want, spend a little time there, go to Bolzano, then to Meran. Meran is wonderful. Like there's a great architecture gallery in Meran, and then you drive up about Meran, you drive into the valley, into the Alps, almost to the Austrian border for about 40 minutes. It's sort of the street gets smaller and smaller. Maybe it's 1 hour or so. And then there is a little town there. And then you drive the last bit. Then there's a gondola for ski tourists. Then you take that up. Then you arrive in a huge landscape, and there's a few skiing places. Because that thing with so you can go skiing there in the winter. There's you see, now I'm not a skier, so I can't say so much about that. And then from here, then it takes about half an hour or so to walk to the sculpture. Or maybe not even, but half an hour probably. It's pretty hard because the air is, for me, it was kind of hard because I couldn't breathe. Or, because it's high enough for you to get exhausted. old people like me, it's like really hard work to get to the sculpture.
Permanently situated work in a temporary place because the place is going to change around it. Actually very interesting. I just wonder, Rail folks, do you think we should take this as a point to start taking some questions?
Yeah, I would love to move into a Q&A. We have some really good questions on deck. If you feel like this is a good place to close out this portion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our first question is from Jason Rosenfeld, editor at large at the Rail. You can take it away. Let's see, where are you? You should be able to unmute yourself right now.
Thank you so much, Anya, and thank you, Olafur and everyone, for a really stimulating discussion. I have a question about the relationship between your art, as you've been talking about, and maybe what you'll phrase as your activism. I went to the Tate Modern exhibition. I think you're totally on point when you're talking about the idea of a flow experience in art museums, the public and art. It's related to sports, academia about sports, about, Icelandic football and the chants and the cheers and everything. But that flow experience that you get in sport is something which also does occur around art. And I think that's something that absolutely needs to be pursued more. And the fog room at London Tate Modern was that kind of experience, even though you can't see anybody around you, is great. But then the true flow experience in that exhibition was at the end, when you leave the artworks proper and you enter the studio environment and you enter, what you guys are doing all the time. And it felt to me as if there's an interesting relationship between the art as exhibited, the sculpture, the environments, the photographs, the documentation, and then what goes on in the studio. And that, frankly, is where everyone was in the exhibit in London. Everyone was no one was leaving that room. People brought their kids. They were working at the tables. They were looking at all the material on the walls that are, what you guys are reading or you're looking at. That is where everyone was focused. And I wonder if you could talk about the relationship between the art, which seems to me a kind of engine to drive what you're really doing, which is this committed environmental activism.
Thank you, Jason.
Talk about that. You're welcome.
How do you do normally? Let me just answer one at a time. I will forget if I don't. So thank you, Jason, for saying that. The show from the Tate is actually currently in Bilbao, what is called Guggenheim Bilbao, and it's open. It was like open forever because of COVID, right? So now it's like open to April next year, if anybody happens to be in that area. So I mean, if there's any artist on this call, probably not if it's me talking, but anyway, if there's any artist, there's that kind of interesting thing. You take someone through the studio and then it's always about how, because that's what you see, like that's the stuff, the machines, the drills, the colors and so on. It's like, how do you do this? And there's never really a chance to see why on earth, what's going on, why on earth? And I mean, except from your parents maybe. But the thing is, at an exhibition, I haven't actually done it much, but now I seem to like it, so I might do it again. The idea to have a stronger emphasis on why without functionalizing the artworks, which might be very, very abstract in the nature, and the open-endedness of that abstraction, I believe, can actually host a type of inclusion, because it doesn't patronize to say you should do this, you shouldn't do this. So it doesn't have a narrative necessarily that carries that type of should I say, the principles is about this. No, it's more like about the nature of the research, which in my case, sometimes the why takes 30% of the attention of a work of art, and then the how, which is like how I then make it. Of course, they kind of overlap and play ping pong with each other. And then the how on earth is it going to be shown is also 30%. It's just like a lot, because if you just hand it over to somebody else to show it, then it's just going to be deprived from its why. How is doing okay normally, right? So I very often try to, in exhibitions, in some way or the other introduce, well, why bother? What is it worth? It's because there's also this challenge a little bit. People have somehow gotten so used to museums that they kind of take it for granted. This is just how it is, right? This is how it is in museums. And there's that challenge with museums also struggling a little bit with reinventing, struggling a lot, to be honest. The inability to reinvent themselves. And I'm into slowness. I'm actually into being, well, not conservative, but just like kind of not be flippant on the other side. But isn't it, I think there's today, I haven't read it, there's are museums actually reacting to COVID? I think New York Times today, there's an article that I pinned, and I just need to check it. But so the show at the Tate had that, and I did it as an alphabet. But it was also interesting because I had one on W. I had the question of we-ness. I apologize. The we-ness question, and not because I work with the we, the expanded we, the we's are getting smaller. But it turns out my we was very small. I'm a privileged white guy. I was like, I don't necessarily fully acknowledge that. And there was an incident with wheelchair. So it's like all that we-ness stuff. And then there was a person in a wheelchair who wrote me and said, I'm not in the we. I'm not. So oh yeah, it's very kind with all your we-ness, Mr. We-ness, right? But what about me? I'm in a wheelchair. I can't go through the tunnel. And she was right. I was blind to my own privilege, as it is, which is often the case with the privilege. I was the only one who doesn't have the privilege who can see it. And so the thing is, the opportunity with this type of studio room is also to expose a degree of vulnerability, because the other exhibition, the sort of the pompous at the Tate Modern, is also amazing, and so on and so forth. And everything looks amazing at the Tate Tottenham, and that means that there is another opportunity, at least an academic one, to go in and be more playful in sort of original idea of the sort of the jazzy version of the idea of playfulness, and so on. And it so happens that room is changing also all the time. It is, well, it's almost the same at the Guggenheim, but it's not completely the same. And I showed the same room in Zurich. In the meantime, I mean, after Tate and before Bilbao, in a much smaller exhibition, that particular exhibition from that room from Tate was in. So I will show it again for sure. I have a show coming up in January at the Gallery Tanya Bonata in this spring, I think. But now everything's just like a mess, right? So who knows when.
Great, thank you so much.
Our next question comes from Laura Wellington, if you want. Where you are. Sorry, you should be able to unmute yourself. I can find you. Sorry about this.
Hi, I'm sorry, I wasn't expecting to be unmuted. So yeah, I suppose you made the statement not flying art around the world, which is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently, and in terms of climate, and thinking about that whether there should be a shift for more renowned, famous artists to create locally, utilizing locally skilled people, but also creating pathways for young people into art, education opportunities, kind of opening up art more for everyone, I suppose. But also whether this is too much to be added to the process. And also, I suppose, in terms of cost, could those pieces of art then be left, and each country or place then creates a collection of art from the artists that have come, and therefore things don't become so transient and meanwhile.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting discussion, and one that is going on a lot, also within the various kinds of artistic communities. Since I think a few years at the studio, we have tried to have a kind of a environmental sort of we have set some goals. It was like, okay, in 10 years we want to be there. This means we have to decrease every year so and so much. We have taken away all the pollutants from the packaging, but or the crating. We have found a new crating company. We have we just started already a little while back to see, well, what can we do? Because so there's different layers. On one side, I'm an artist, but I'm also an employer. I have 100 people in the studio, but I'm also a civic person, and I'm not any lesser or more than than anyone else, and I have the same responsibility as everyone else. So in that studio, there's like both me as an employer, as a little company, or me as an artist to address in what I say when I get to say something. So for instance, I had a Japanese show at MOT, Museum of Tokyo, which closed only 3 weeks ago, and it opened in this February, delayed again, and so on and so forth. And for that show, we set the highest yet standard for how environmental we want to be. So this is a long description, and the theme of the show also to some extent, which is fair enough, is occasionally with me anyway. How do we make a show in Japan with the absolute lowest carbon footprint? So one of the many things was, well, we're going to send the art that we are sending and not producing locally. We're going to maximize the local production, but the one we send, we're going to send it by train from Berlin to Tokyo. And of course, the art transport company, they said, "Oh, that's really a bad idea. You're going to have to send it through Russia and China, and through Hamburg, through Poland, and to Russia, China, down Mongolia." And it's amazing. We said, "It's fantastic." And I did then also a little artwork, which was like these drawing machines on paper, which I worked with before. So it was like in every artwork, I put a little piece of white paper with a kind of a ball of ink on it, so I could somehow trace. And then I could see if they have tilted the artworks also, if the ball was always down there. So in the exhibition, actually, there was like 16 or 12 or whatever. So round drawings of like kind of the train sort of shaking. So it's like a drawing of the topography between Berlin and Tokyo. But the funny thing is, the transport company called back and said, we told you it's not possible. The insurance company does not want to insure it. They said they can't. What do you mean? The train is full of stuff all the time going that way. Yeah, but that's not art. No, but it's pencils, it's washing machines. You send things by train all the time. What's wrong? No, we can't do art this way. Of course, the alternative is shipping on boat or in flight. So then I said, okay, let me talk to the insurance company. Then I talked to the insurance company, which wasn't really a big thing because it was the same insurance company as mine, it turned out. I said, okay, we're going to change the insurance company. We're going to tell everyone we know that you are not going to be environmentally friendly. Very short version. In 1 hour, it was all solved, right? And then, of course, you can insure it. It was just because they had to go through the agony of finding out how to insure stuff on train and so on and so forth. So the thing is, there is actually all the time something one can do everywhere. And the easy things is to change the bit of paper and stuff we are using, right? How to buy this and how we have become, we subscribe once a year with a bigger sum of money to a farmer association just outside of Berlin. And then we have a box delivered. And these are common things everywhere in the world. Well, this is not so usual anymore. And slowly, once we get into it, and I guess it takes about, the goal is to use 10 years to become very environmentally on the upside and see where is all the sort of opportunities here. So now we are trying to not traveling, not flying. I've made not just because of COVID, but also I'm just like so enjoying not flying. I don't know what we were doing before. This whole idea of going back to what was like crazy. I've been flying twice now since March. It's like crazy. And it's so horrible. I mean, why didn't I not see how horrible the airports are? I mean, no, it's like sounds so negative, but I just realized, I was reminded how stressful it is. So it is evidently incredibly complex because it's very difficult to sit and say, we learned things, because we should be mindful of all the people who just lost someone or are struggling, and it is so bloody difficult also. But let's also not forget the few things that we have learned, such as how slow can be beautiful, and how being down to earth and staying with the trouble can be beautiful. How to become the garden instead of being the gardener, or the gardener instead of being the garden, or whatever. You get it. So there's also a bit of work to be done on our inside, and that's why I get so upset when people say, "Oh, when this is over, it's going to be so nice to get back to how it was." It was like horrible. It was absolutely not going to go back to where it was. We're gonna walk forward into the future and not backward.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for asking, Laura.
Yep.
Our next question comes from Helen, who asks, you mentioned Glissant. Have his theories influenced your work? Coexistence and co-sculpture seem to echo Glissant's poetics of relation.
I didn't. I missed the middle part. Well, say it again quickly. What? I didn't hear it.
This is from Helen Colton, who asks, you mentioned Glissant. Have his theories influenced your work? Coexistence and co-sculpture seems to echo Glissant's poetics of relation.
Yes, Glissant, it was through the book that Hans Ulrich Obrist edited, which is maybe, not very close to the source, to Glissant anyway, but he was a big advocate for Glissant, and through Hans Ulrich Obrist, I learned it. It's a very recommendable book. I think there are, so people as progressive as Glissant seems to say things with such generosity that they have this ability to integrate in any context. And I think his poetry has this ability to somehow just be a kind of a mold that takes, wherever it is used, and it just somehow sucks up reality and shapes it. I don't know how to better say it. I've been very interested in this kind of an idea of pluralistic aesthetics, or this idea of it's not really post-ideological, but evidently we are in a place now where a lot of the old binary rules are not working. And this idea of the kind of agora, this idea of something more chaotic, or this idea of a kind of the mercado, right? This notion of an assembly which is not necessarily organized by the traditional normative sort of rules is so evidently an opportunity now. There is system design, I think you could say. There's the notion of systems. I think art is revealing a potential also as a system rather than an object. We started with objects like that, right? And it's a bit precarious because systems for many people means, like something like in the bank or something. It was I really mean system like something organic, somehow like Lynn Margulis. Like this notion of symbiosis, things that are kind of codependent on each other and co-producing and so on and so forth. And I think Glissant has some of that in his, because he has this generosity. I was actually, because of my partner, I have got it read to me, I should say. Thomas Sankara from Burkina Faso in 1984 did a speech at UN. I just have to say, if so you want to read something progressive, like, and it's from 84, progressive about women, children, and art, at a speech at a UN by the president of Burkina Faso wearing a full military uniform. And you kind of sometimes look at the UN General Assembly and say, oh my God, what is going on there? But I am so utterly and unbelievably touched. 86, I'm so sorry, Thomas Sankara, 86 at UN, and the year after he was shot. And I've since then met artist Jonna Comfra, who I know a little bit, who I think is like an unbelievable, amazing artist, and he met Thomas Sankara. So I'm like so happy I met somebody who met Thomas Sankara. It's just to say that to some extent, Glissant traveled far and I traveled far to meet up. It's not an obvious, it is now obvious, but it was not obvious for many, many years. And now I'm meeting someone like Thomas Sankara, who died in 87 or was assassinated in 87. And it's like so progressive and so amazing. So in that sense, when you speak about Glisson, I just think there is so much changing now. There's and I'm being cautious to somehow verbalize it fully, because I also label it when I do so, and I just want to be mindful of the need for things being labeled not by me but by people who have a stronger version or a better version of what is to be said in that field. So in that sense, I'm incredibly inspired as to what is actually possible now. So I'm very much into how is it being in Berlin. There's a famous quote that pops up occasionally in Berlin. I'm not looking east, I'm not looking west. No, I'm not facing east, I'm not facing west. I'm facing forward. Right. So I think I'm facing forward. Wasn't really very Glisson, but in a way it is. I'm probably not facing forward, by the way. You know, who knows? I'm probably walking backwards into the future, like the Paul Klee did a watercolor. No, he did a print that Walter Benjamin bought called the Angelus Novus, Angelus or Angelus Novus, like the new angel, which travels backwards into the future, or something like that. And Benjamin, who doesn't like reproductions of art, he was like, what a hypocrite. That's typical of those left-wingers. Then they say, oh, my reproduction of art. And then he buys a print. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. That's a Berlin humor. Like, so, listen, Valerie, I've been so excited about you reading poetry. I think we should, because at this point, I'm really not saying anything important. And Valerie, you're just like so much more interesting than me.
We have one last question from Fong, who we are a publisher. Thank you so much for that thoughtful answer, Olafur.
Oh, where are you?
Yeah, there you are.
Olafur, thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Pong.
You early on mentioned Rodin, and of course the first slide, the great work of art. All of us have seen it several times, The Walking Man. And then you mentioned various conditions of time, which certainly Rodin's own experience of time, and we see how in The Walking Man, the sense of realism on one hand, and the sense of motion or movement of passing through time in The Walking Man. And you mentioned also Baron Haussmann, new construction of Paris as a huge commission by Napoleon III, which was the central man-made synthesis of artifice and nature in a way, or nature and man-made environment that provided the genesis of Impressionism. And what is so interesting, thinking back now at the moment for me, is that Rodin was in fact a year younger than Cézanne, you know, but he lived longer than Cézanne. Cézanne died in 1906, and Rodin, you know, lived till, I think, at least 1917. We know that Rilke came to work for him as a secretary in 1902 till 1910, something like that. But my point is, to me, thinking what you have just mentioned, is that the best landscape painters, you know, have always been those who live in the city. You know, it's so interesting. I mean, you know, we know that about the Barbizon school, the Impressionists and whatnot, but we also know further back, like the first true landscape didn't appear till the 1st century BC in Roman art. We tend to forget that Rome or any Roman city were always super compressed, packed, and highly populated. So the owners of such, you know, urban villas often commission artists to make fresco of landscape of any, not any specific locale, but were often invented by the imagination, mostly scenes of idyllic, mysterious, or sacred landscape, as though they offer a kind of a spiritual comfort or a form of escape from the annoyances of the urban environment. My question is, all right, moving forward a little bit to Huysman again, because you mentioned him twice in the beginning, who we know invented the whole idea of urban planning, you know, the boulevard, the square, the park, and so on. Do you think his influence and effects still very much relevant, and how we now mediate our relationship between man-made environment and nature, and how's that also have an effect on your work?
Oh, Pong, thank you for the question. My God, everybody's asking so it's like everyone is so smart. You should see how American looks in the press over here. But it's like no, that was supposed to be a joke. This is so interesting. I think Huysman is, I just need to, your whole question is still arriving, Pong. The thing is, you know, what we maybe forget and how we enjoy walking in Paris, and there's like every corner is like round and it's like so generous, and you just like kind of feel comfortable. And Huysman came up with this idea of rounding the corners so the gendarmerie were not surprised by potential revolutionaries, right? There was no, you can't really hide behind a corner and attack someone because there's a round corner. So there's like there's a sort of a safety public, well, let's face it, a sort of surveillance kind of built into it, right? So, and it, of course, it swings both ways. But so a lot of the sort of the boulevards and all of that was a sort of a method to prevent further escalating messiness. And I guess this is, in a way, this narrative of how power structures are integrated into tissues and then forgotten. And we then think, well, houses with round corners is better, but we forget it's sweeter because it looks like Paris. But we forget that they were made to prevent people from liberating themselves. It's like, so it's interesting. And so obviously coming from Scandinavia, where there was a handful of attempts to go against Huysman, like Norbert Schulz, who then, of course, everyone went against afterwards and all of that. But let me make a more small, because I said round corner, so you said landscape painting. When I started in art school in '89, I went to the following year. I started a week before the Berlin Wall fell down. The next year I went to New York and I went to MoMA, and I actually saw that in the lobby, I saw that curved Monet painting. Okay. And if I'm not wrong, it's from 1920 or 22. It was just after was it not after the First World War? And Monet did in the Orangerie in Paris these very, very famous, very large Monet paintings, like maybe the best of the lilies, right? It's an oval room with curved walls, and there's these 4 enormous paintings by him, which is like this amazing transcendental, sort of incredible landscape summarizing a lot of what has been going on in various type of impressionistic things. And so just the idea of doing these large scale paintings is like incredible, like this immersive other idea. And I was thinking about the First World War, which had such atrocities and it was just so unbelievably traumatizing, right? It was like so, to come out of the war and then make these paintings is very interesting, I think, because I'm actually working on my exhibition in New York now. And, not to say that, we have, this just sounds so superficial and so on to say, but, so what do we then do? Are we gonna, I was so touched by when I saw that Monet at the MoMA, and then later I found out it was built standing on the shoulders of a world war. I just think this was amazing. It gave it another meaning. I also remember in Stockholm when I saw Rauschenberg's goat with a car tire around it. I found that so touching. So I'm not just saying everything is sort of transcendental, like this amazing artist. I haven't seen the show, of course, at the Whitney right now. What's the name again? It did some kind of a painter, a woman painter from the 30s. See, I don't know it so well. She's from New Mexico, transcendental landscape or something. It's a little bit esoteric, but really, I think, very important.
Peyton, yes.
Yeah, Peyton.
Peyton. And yes.
Yeah,
yes.
so the thing is now, I have an exhibition in New York. So it's not really about the exhibition. I say this, it's about how do we make art now? And what's the right thing to make? Because it's not easy to come out of the First World War and say, I'm just going to make these lily paintings. It seems like. So I'm very interested in you know what, I have so many friends in New York and I miss them profoundly. I miss hugging them and holding them. And I can just see the differences in the countries. I can see the sameness, but I think this is so touching. There is a kind of a trauma. And I really, really hope that everyone is going to vote next week. You know, it's like, I cannot say how America has changed. And it is so difficult. And how does one, as an artist, contribute with an appropriate response? So I'm really trying to somehow understand what was Monet thinking about? It's not necessarily my favorite artwork in the world, but standing on the shoulders of all the revolutions before him and then do that. Acknowledging the revolution is not dismissing, it's not escapism, because it is so fraternal and it has this kind of intimacy that we are missing. Right? This is what we miss. The rehumanization of the intimate spaces, the kind of reoccupying our own skin that is being taken away from these Zoom calls, right? It's like taking in the spaces that we share and not the ones, and so on. I see the complexities and I'm making vast generalizations, but it is simply an interesting question. What do we then do? There's that American science fiction author, I have to look it up. We have arrived at the end, haven't we? No, we have arrived at the end. Why don't we start here? It's very interesting. That's the closest I get to Monet.
Well, the Monet painting, Olafur, it's very interesting that you describe. I mean, I don't know the one in MoMA is a great example. Doug, you can correct me because
there were two, Fang. So the first series was bought in 1955 and it burned because MoMA had a fire, and then the second, what we see today, is not what was there initially. But the other interesting point, is that Monet was toward the end of his life. His life cycle. He had reached a point where he could look upon the world in a very philosophical way and not care, and then care a lot as well.
But that's the point, is that when it was on experience of fire, when they therefore need to reline them on the new canvas, therefore they apply heat on top of the surface, all of us. So therefore the brushstroke was flattened out, so you don't experience the same way. But my point is, you know, exactly what you just described here, Doug. He wanted to instead portray the water surface. He wanted to do it as if they are as big as the canvas allow him to. You know, the physical sense of the scale. And you know, that's what anticipate abstract expressionists, particularly Pollock. I think that we learned that from Clement Greenberg, late Monet, famous essay published in 1959.
I guess, Pong, what I'm saying is that I respect that, but Clement Greenberg very much focused on the how, and I'm really interested in the why.
Got it.
And this is because I wasn't really ever a massive Monet fan or anything, but obviously one always is anyway. But the point of the times in which we live are like so hard to hold on to.
Yeah,
we're so thinned out on everything. Our pool of worries is full, and our biases are untransparent.
Yeah.
It's just like hard to make a choice even. And this, I think, is an interesting time to make a work of art, and you know, the balance of not being too much in people's face and not being escapistic on the other side, or new age. Yeah. That's why I was interested in the show at Whitney, just like kind of how precise. I mean, now I can't see it, of course, which is annoying, but you know, so I'm just very interested in it.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Olafur. That was great. Back to you, Anya.
Thank you both for that conversation. Just thinking about where we go from here. I know for me, this Zoom space has been made a little bit more interactive, human, with our daily tradition of closing out with a poem. And it's a real tradition that we have of ending lunch with a poem, and we've carried those into these Zoom events. And today I'm thrilled to welcome Valerie Deas to the stage as our poet. Valerie Deas is a poet, film programmer, and radio show host. She is the host of Project 35, curates Film North's Cinema Lounge, and is the shorts programmer for the Provincetown International Film Festival. So the floor is yours, Valerie.
Hi, thank you very much. All right, I'm just going to start reading, and yeah, let's just begin. 1, planning. Home is a place and a state. We discuss every possibility, map out the rules, burn the current blueprints until the wool wakes up. The room moves cautiously between us. While we decode our human selves, that's what the night does, lets us be ourselves, makes us wide open. We take big gulps of who we are. Homeland is a planet. We talk world building until the streetlights come on. We play hard to get with sleep and nod and nod and nod. In our original conditions, we take liberties with the location of the Big Dipper, following the plot points on the map of your back, while our factory settings are set somewhere between bougie and brave. My head tilts to the side and I listen with good posture as I bleed through several layers of black. Second poem. 2, strategies. Your picture from the park made me blush, transforming me from dusk to tobacco. In one sip, one word in, I knew we were holding each other somewhere in the blue. In this revolution, I think you have my mother's hair. Roller waves back to the black future with a defiant bounce. I sit and thank you with my hand in a way both real and imagined. You're the type of alchemy that works on me. Ask me again about sleep when your face is a grainy shadow of shivering gray dots. In the middle of the night, are you waiting for something? Next poem, sleeping, walking, dreaming about that muggy apartment with windows facing a nowhere city. Mondays kicked off with Coltrane's My Favorite Things and ended with Monk's Haitian fight song. The breath of the ceiling fan above our bodies, dim in the morning hours, close enough for communion. We are a puddle of soft, flesh salted by sweat. This is my favorite version of us, effortless, unfolding before the day is done with us. My final poem, Forget Water. Though I don't feel like one, I try to be a person, or at least look like a person. One leg follows the other, while I stretch my lips over my teeth. My dead-eyed small talk gets smaller. I forget cups of water in every room. I enter and leave, standing vigil over particles caught in soft rays of light. Wait, pardon me, but I don't remember as well anymore. I give out more than I should, and I never wait for change. I stop understanding words. Instead, I walk away, dog-eared, hitchhiking other people's conversations, hoping to avoid the speed of my thoughts. But I slip back, I slip back. I never noticed the view of the city, partly devastated, mostly heartbroken. The buzzing never stops, and there's still so much more crying to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie, for a beautiful and grounding reading to close out this event. And thank you so much, Olafur, Julie, and Doug, for your conversation. This has been so wonderful. And thank you all who tuned in today and asked questions. Please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a radical poetry reading with our poet C.A. Conrad, and we'll be featuring political poetry read by Raquel Salas Rivera, Carlos Soto Roman, and Eileen Miles. And you should now be able to turn on your microphone and say goodbye, and thank you. And let me just make sure.
Pleasure, Olafur.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
That was terrific.
Yeah.
Thank you, Olafur. Thanks for Lee and Doug.
Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie.
Thank you,
You're
Alison.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Vote.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Olafur.
Dios.
Oh, this is the most exciting I've tried a long time. Wow, a lot of people in once. It's like a group hug. Group hug.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Looking forward to your show.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
My favorite thing. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Julie. Thank you all.
Good life.
Thank you.
Much love. Thank you, Valerie. My
Valerie, loved your poem.
Bye,
Oh,
Olafur.
thank you. Thanks.
Thank
So much.
you.
Eres fantástico.
Much love and peace. Ciao. Let's get
Ciao.
ciao. Much love and peace.